She thought that day would be the most humiliating day of her life, but she was wrong, because that was also the first time the Duke had seen her, truly seen her. On the day of the bride's selection, the scent of gold dust and bay leaves wafted through the Rose Manor in the capital. 700 white candles burned in the chandeliers, illuminating the entire hall until it felt scorching hot. But what was truly scorching wasn't the candlelight. It was everyone's gaze. They were all watching her stand in the center of the hall, like a bird stripped of its feathers. That dress had originally been left to her by her late mother, silver gray satin embroidered with delicate pearls, the cuffs worn white, the hem altered 3 times. She had worn it with the utmost care for 3 years. All for today, all for this moment. Standing in the line of prospective brides, her heart pounded like a deer being chased by a hunter, her palms drenched in cold sweat. Yet she still managed to stand tall. Then, the sound came. Rip! The sound of fabric tearing exploded behind her, like a blunt knife slicing through the silence. She didn't even have time to react. First, a chill ran down her back. Then, the left shoulder strap snapped clean off. The satin of the dress split from her armpit, all the way to her waist. The pearls fell to the ground, bounced, rolled down the steps, and shattered one by one in the silence. Someone was laughing. It was the voice of her second older sister, Cecily, as sweet as honey laced with arsenic. "Oh my, Evelyn, isn't that dress of yours just too old? How could it shatter at the slightest touch? It really is something unfit for public view." Her eldest sister, Loretta, stood beside Cecily, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes curved into 2 icy crescents. She said nothing, merely glancing down at her bright red manicure, a silver gray thread still caught between her nails. Everyone around them was watching. The noble young ladies whispered among themselves, half-smiling faces peeking out from behind their fans. The male guests averted their eyes, not out of respect, but because they found the scene embarrassing. Several elderly noblewomen frowned, yet the corners of their mouths turned up slightly, like vultures that had caught the scent of rotting flesh. Evelyn stood frozen in place, clutching the torn fabric against her chest with all her might, her knuckles white and her whole body trembling. She could feel her bare shoulder exposed to the air, and she could feel hundreds of gazes piercing her skin like needles. She didn't cry. She told herself she mustn't cry, but she could feel something rising in her throat, scorching, bitter, carrying with it all the grievances and suppressed pain of 16 years. She remembered her mother holding her hand as she lay dying and saying, "Don't be afraid." She remembered the guilt on her father's face, the day he brought that woman into the house. She remembered the words her stepmother had spoken the first time she shoved her into the storage room. "You're nothing but a burden. It's already a mercy that I feed you." She recalled every morning and evening over the years, wearing hand-me-downs from her older sisters, eating their leftovers, and walking with her head bowed amid their mocking laughter. She had endured it all, because today was the bride selection ceremony, because if she were chosen by any nobleman, any one of them, she could leave that house. She could survive, but they wouldn't even give her that chance. They wanted her to stand naked before all the nobles of the capital, like a fledgling stripped of its feathers, to be mocked, humiliated, and driven out. Cecily stepped on a scrap of cloth on the floor, ground it under her toe, then leaned down and whispered in her ear, "Get back to your kitchen, you bastard. Do you know what kind of place this is? This is a stage prepared for true ladies. You've even stolen the right to stand here." Evelyn bit her lip. The taste of blood spread across her tongue, salty, bitter, and scalding. She should have run. She should have covered her face and bolted from the hall, retreating to that dim storage room, wrapping herself in a thin blanket, and waiting for her stepmother's punishment and her sister's mockery to wash over her like a tidal wave. Her feet had already begun to retreat. But just as she turned, a gust of wind swept in. Not the wind from outside the window. It was the wind whipped up by the cloak. That black cloak flew in from the other end of the hall, like a descending night curtain, sweeping down to cover her completely, carrying the scent of pine and cold iron, and settling heavily on her shoulders. The thick wool instantly wrapped around her bare skin, and the silk lining inside the cloak still retained body heat. Not hers, but someone else's warm, like a hand pressed firmly against her trembling back. She froze. The entire room froze. The music stopped. The whispers ceased. Even the candle flames seemed to have their throats clamped shut, suddenly dimming. Then she heard footsteps. Leather boots struck the marble floor. One step, then another, steady and measured, like some great beast surveying its territory. The crowd parted automatically, like a tide split by an invisible sword. Not a single person dared to look up. When he stepped into the candlelight, Evelyn felt as though she were dreaming. The Duke of Leonor, Lord of the northern frontier, the kingdom's iron-fisted bulwark, a man to whom even the king would bow his head. He wore a black military dress uniform, his silver epaulets glinting coldly in the candlelight. His black hair was combed back with military precision, revealing a face one dared not look upon directly. His brow bones were too deep, his jawline too sharp, and his gray-blue eyes resembled two ancient pieces of glass frozen beneath a layer of ice, devoid of any warmth. He was tall, so tall that even when Evelyn craned her neck, she could see only the curve of his Adam's apple and an old scar on his chin. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Cecily. "Did you tear this?" Just 3 words. His voice wasn't loud. In fact, it was quite soft, like the friction of a blade sliding from its sheath. Cecily's face went pale in an instant. She instinctively took half a step back, her lips trembling as she forced out a stiff smile. "Your Grace, I don't know what you're talking about. She did it herself by accident." "I didn't ask how it happened." He cut her off, his tone as flat as if discussing the weather. "I asked, did you tear it? Is that it?" Cecily's legs were trembling. Loretta stood beside her, the mask of composure on her face beginning to crack. Her fingers clenched the fan's ribs so tightly her knuckles turned white. The hall was so quiet, one could hear the crackling of the candle wicks. Then the Duke turned around. He looked down at Evelyn. When those gray-blue eyes met hers, she felt as though a hand had clenched her heart. Not out of fear, but because there was no pity in those eyes, no condescending charity, only scrutiny. As if examining a piece of jade covered in dust, he calmly and intently peeled away, inch by inch, all her embarrassment and shame. He looked at her for a long time, so long that Evelyn felt she was about to suffocate. Then he did something that made the entire hall gasp. He raised his hand and wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth with his thumb. The movement was gentle. The calluses on his fingertip were rough and warm, like a stone baked by the sun. He wiped clean the wound on her lip, one she'd bitten herself, then withdrew his blood-stained thumb and wiped it expressionlessly on his cuff. "What is her name?" He was addressing the aide de camp behind him. "Miss Evelyn, Your Grace, the eldest daughter of the late Sir Merritt, currently under the guardianship of her stepmother, Lady Vera." The Duke said nothing. He pulled the cloak back tightly over Evelyn's shoulders, his long fingers fastening the silver clasp at her collarbone, with a clean, decisive motion, as if sheathing a sword. Then he turned to face everyone. "The selection of a bride ends here." His voice was not loud, yet it struck like a boulder dropped into still water, sending ripples that made everyone's faces go pale. "I have already chosen." He seized Evelyn's wrist and pulled her to her feet. The hem of her cloak swept over the scattered shards of pearls and fragments of dresses, like a black banner dragged across a battlefield. Evelyn was forced to stumble along behind him, her mind a blank, her ears ringing, hearing only the pounding of her own heart and the incredulous screams her stepsisters were forcing from their throats. She glanced back. Cecily sat slumped on the ground, the color completely drained from her face. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Loretta stood behind her, her face twisted like a shattered mirror, beautiful, sharp, and fragmented. Her stepmother, Lady Vera, burst out of the crowd, her face ashen, her mouth agape, yet she dared not pursue him, for the Duke's stride did not falter, not for a single moment. Evelyn was dragged through the hall, the candlelight rushing past on either side, the icy night wind pouring in from the end of the corridor, stinging her cheeks. Her bare feet pressed against the cold stone floor, her toes curled, and every step felt like walking on the edge of a knife. But she did not struggle, for she felt the hand gripping her wrist, knuckles prominent, its grip steady and terrifying, like a pair of iron shackles pulling her out of a quagmire. She did not know where he was taking her. She only knew that, in her 16 years of life, this was the first time anyone had used a cloak in broad daylight to declare to everyone that she was not unwanted, that she was not someone to be torn apart at will, that she was not a bug to be trampled underfoot. He was the Duke, the cold, ruthless, and all-powerful Duke of Leonor. And at the bride selection ball, he had walked past 30 noble young ladies of high birth to approach a Cinderella, whose dress had been torn to shreds by her stepsister. He draped his cloak over her shoulders and then announced to the whole world, "I have made my choice." Evelyn did not know at the time that this cloak wrapped around more than just her torn dress and exposed skin. It sheltered a conspiracy about to ignite, a destiny she had never imagined, and a heart one even the Duke himself was unwilling to admit, that was slowly thawing. What she knew even less was that, in the world of that man, whose smile held not a shred of warmth, donning his cloak meant, from this moment on, her fate and his were inextricably bound. And at Rose Manor, the hands that tore her dress would soon discover that what they had ripped apart was not merely a piece of fabric. What they had torn open was a rift in the power structure of the entire aristocracy, one that could never be mended. As the carriage rolled out through the iron gates of Rose Manor, the wheels ground against the gravel path, producing a series of dull thuds that felt like some kind of muffled thunder rumbling beneath her feet. Evelyn huddled in the corner of the carriage, her fingers clenched around the silver clasp of her cloak, until her knuckles turned white. The cloak was too large, its hem pooled at her bare feet, and the cuffs spilled over her fingertips, wrapping her up like a drowning person pulled from the water. The scent of pine and cold iron lingered, mingling with the musty leather of the carriage, making her head spin slightly. She stole a glance at the man sitting across from her. The Duke leaned back in the leather chair opposite her, one long leg casually draped over the other, flipping through a parchment scroll, his expression as calm as if nothing had just happened. Candlelight filtered through the crystal lampshades on the carriage walls, casting sharp, defined shadows across his face. The shadows beneath his brow were deep, the hollows beneath his cheekbones looked as if carved by a knife, and his lips were pressed into a line so thin it was almost imperceptible. He said nothing. She dared not speak either, but 1,000 questions churned in her mind. Why her? Did he even know who she was? Was he taking pity on her, or, no, impossible? The Duke of Leonor never did anything superfluous. The entire kingdom knew that this man had a purpose for every action, with at least 3 backup plans behind each one, every plan built upon the bones of others. She had heard the rumors. On the night of the blood moon at the northern border, he had single-handedly severed the rebel leader's head. As he carried that head back to camp, The expression on his face was exactly the same as it was now. No anger, no triumph, only an absolute calm that sent a chill down one's spine. How could a man like that possibly take away a fallen heiress, whose dress had been torn by her stepsister, at a bride selection gathering simply on a whim? Have you had enough of looking? His voice suddenly rang out deep and resonant, rumbling from the depths of his chest with a hint of hoarseness. He didn't look up, his eyes remained fixed on the parchment scroll, but Evelyn felt as though that single sentence had choked the life out of her. She jerked her head down, her cheeks burning as if she'd been slapped, her heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might leap out of her throat. I'm sorry, No need to apologize. He turned a page of the parchment, the paper making a crisp rustling sound. From now on, you don't need to apologize to anyone. Evelyn froze. The words came too suddenly, too directly, like a dagger driven precisely into the softest part of her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but found her throat blocked by something. A bitter burning sensation rising from her stomach and welling up into her eyes. 16 years. For 16 years, nearly every sentence she'd spoken had begun with, "I'm sorry. Sorry for getting in my sister's way. Sorry for eating the last piece of bread. Sorry for making my stepmother angry. Sorry for existing in this world." Those words had been carved into her bones, becoming part of her very breath. And now, with a single offhand remark, this man was telling her it wasn't needed anymore. She lowered her head, bit her lip, and fought desperately to hold back the heat welling up in her eyes. She couldn't cry. She couldn't cry in front of him. She didn't know why, but she instinctively knew he didn't need tears. He wasn't the kind of man who would be moved by tears. "Put your shoes on," he spoke again, his tone still that emotionless, commanding one. But this time, he set down the parchment scroll, his gray-blue eyes resting on her bare feet. Only then did Evelyn realize how pitiful her feet looked. The soles were raw and chafed, her toes caked with dust and grit, and the instep bore a bruise where her stepsister Cecily had stomped on it with her heel, a purplish-blue mark swollen and glossy. She instinctively tried to pull her feet back under her cloak, but he bent down. Duke Leonor, Lord of the Northern Frontier, the kingdom's iron-fisted bulwark, bent down, retrieved a pair of new velvet slippers from beneath his seat, and placed them at her feet. "Put them on." One word. Evelyn stared at the shoes for 2 seconds. They weren't old, nor had anyone else worn them. They were new. Velvet uppers, soft soles, a silver rose embroidered on the toe. Exactly the same as the silver brooch on her cloak. As if they'd been prepared just for her. Her heart gave a violent thud. No, it couldn't be. He couldn't have prepared shoes just for her. She shook off that absurd thought, bent down, and slipped the shoes on with trembling fingers. The velvet against the soles of her feet felt unbelievably soft, like walking on clouds. The top of the shoe hugged her ankle perfectly, neither too tight nor too loose. Just right. Just right. She mulled over those 3 words in her mind, and the more she did, the more her heart raced. "We're here." When the carriage came to a stop, the Duke rose first and pushed open the door. The night breeze swept in, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth, along with a sharp biting aroma of the northern wilderness that she had never smelled before. Evelyn followed him out of the carriage, then froze in her tracks. This wasn't the Duke's mansion. It was a manor she had never seen before. No, manor didn't even begin to describe it. It resembled a black colossus slumbering beneath the moonlight, its high walls of blue stone overgrown with withered vines, the spires of its towers piercing the night sky, and a few scattered warm yellow lights glowing through the windows, like the half-open eyes of a giant beast. 2 rows of black-clad attendants stood before the main gate, each with a blank expression, their movements as uniform and precise as a line of wound up mechanical dolls. The Duke did not look back at her, striding straight toward the gate. His black military boots struck the cobblestones, each step marking an unquestionable rhythm. The hem of his cloak billowed behind him like black flames. Evelyn jogged to keep up with him. Her soft shoes made almost no sound on the flagstones, yet her heart pounded like a drum. The moment she stepped into the hall, she felt as though she had entered another world. The vaulted ceiling soared to an unimaginable height. The black marble floor reflected the dancing flames in the fireplace, and the walls were lined with portraits of past dukes, each face as stern as if plucked from a glacier, their gray-blue eyes sharing a common lineage. Their piercing stares, seeming to penetrate the canvas, made Evelyn feel as though she were surrounded by a pack of silent wolves. Take her to bathe and change. The Duke gave a brief order to a female housekeeper in a gray skirt standing beside him, then walked up the staircase without looking back. His footsteps paused only when he reached the turn of the staircase. I want to see you in my study, before sunrise tomorrow. Before Evelyn could reply, his figure had already vanished into the depths of the second-floor corridor. The housekeeper was a woman in her 40s, her gray, white hair combed with meticulous precision. Her expression mirrored that of everyone in the estate, respectful, aloof, devoid of any superfluous emotion. Yet in the way she looked at Evelyn, there was a sliver of pity, so faint it was almost imperceptible. Please, follow me, miss. She led Evelyn through one corridor after another, each seemingly endless. Every 10 paces, a candelabra hung from the wall. The flames burned quietly within their glass shades, illuminating the tapestries on the walls, each depicting scenes of war, blood and fire and shattered swords, stained a deep crimson by the passage of time. Evelyn's palms were clammy with sweat. She wondered what she had gotten herself into, why the estate was as quiet as a tomb, why the housekeeper's eyes held pity, and what the Duke intended to tell her in his study before sunrise tomorrow. But what she wanted to know, most of all, was why he had chosen her. The bathroom was filled with steam. The marble tub was filled to the brim with hot water, its surface dotted with rose petals and rosemary. As the housekeeper helped her remove her cloak, her movements paused. On Evelyn's back was an old scar that stretched from her shoulder blade all the way to her waist. The color had faded, but the shape remained, like a snake dried by the passage of time. The housekeeper said nothing, merely folding the cloak and placing it on the nearby divan before stepping out. Evelyn sank into the hot water. The temperature was so scalding it made her skin redden, but she didn't move. She needed this heat. She needed this temperature that made her feel alive. She closed her eyes, her mind replaying everything that had happened today. The tearing of her dress, her stepsister's laughter, 300 pairs of eyes piercing her skin like needles, and then the cloak, the black cloak descending like a storm, the scent of pine and cold iron flooding her nostrils, and his eyes. When those gray-blue eyes met hers, she saw something else beneath that icy surface. Not tenderness, not pity, it was recognition, like one wolf recognizing another wounded wolf. The thought made her snap her eyes open, staring at the damp mist on the ceiling, her heart pounding painfully. When she stepped out of the bathroom in fresh clothes, the housekeeper was already waiting at the door. She held a cup of hot milk, which she handed to Evelyn, saying softly, "The Duke wishes you to rest well. I'll come to wake you before sunrise tomorrow." Evelyn took the milk as her fingertips brushed against the housekeeper's hand. She felt the woman's fingers were slightly cool, with a faint, barely perceptible tremor. "Are you afraid of him?" Evelyn blurted out. The housekeeper remained silent for a long time, so long that Evelyn thought she would never answer. Then she looked up, her aged eyes reflecting the candlelight at the end of the hallway, and spoke words that kept Evelyn awake all night. "Miss, everyone in this estate is afraid of him. But you are different." How am I different? The housekeeper turned away, her voice so low it was almost drowned out by the crackling of the firewood in the hearth. Because in these 16 years, you are the first woman to walk into this estate wearing his cloak, and that cloak is the only memento his mother left him. Evelyn's hand, holding the glass of milk, froze. At the end of the hallway, the flames in the fireplace leapt suddenly, stretching the housekeeper's shadow on the wall into a long, twisted black line. Outside the window, the north wind howled past the spires of the tower, emitting a wail that sounded like a low sob, yet also like a warning. Meanwhile, in the study on the second floor, the Duke stood at the window, hands in his trouser pockets, his gray-blue eyes reflecting the boundless night beyond. On the desk before him lay an unfolded intelligence report. The parchment bore a single line of text, written in the kingdom's highest-grade cipher ink, which glowed faintly in the candlelight. Behind Lady Vera lies the king's pawn. The bride selection ceremony is a trap set for you. He tucked the intelligence into a drawer, a cold, emotionless curve forming at the corner of his mouth. A trap? He would see just who had fallen into whose trap. Evelyn stood in the hallway, holding the glass of milk for a long time. So long that the steam on the glass gradually dissipated, and a thin film of cream formed on the surface of the milk. That one thought kept running through her mind. The cloak was the only memento his mother had left him. Why? Why was it his mother's memento? Why had no one worn it all these years? Why had he given it to her, of all people? She looked down at the cloak resting in the crook of her arm. A few fragments of rose petals from Rose Manor still clung to the wool, and the silver clasp glowed faintly in the candlelight. She reached out to touch the silver clasp, her fingertips brushing against an engraving on the back. Turning it over, she saw a line of tiny lettering. The letters had been worn faint by time, but she could still make them out beyond the north blood of blood. Her hand trembled as she flipped the clasp over. She recognized this family motto. There was no one in the entire kingdom who did not. The Leonor family had guarded the north for generations. Their family motto was carved into the walls and gates of every border fortress. It was not Latin, nor was it one of those flowery maxims common among the nobility, but a phrase cold and hard to the core. North of the north, blood of blood. It meant that any foreign threat facing the lands of the north would be crushed, and only those with Leonor blood could protect this land. Yet, he had given her the cloak bearing this motto. To a fallen heiress with no blood ties to him, who had grown up trampled underfoot by her stepmother and stepsister, she clenched the corner of the cloak, so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't think about it anymore. The more she thought, the more frightened she became. The more she thought, the more she felt that everything that had happened overnight was unreal, like a dream from which she might wake at any moment. And the most terrifying thing in that dream wasn't those who had humiliated her, but this silent, cold, and inscrutable man. She returned to the room the butler had arranged for her, pushed open the door, and froze once more. This was no servant's quarters. It wasn't even an ordinary guest room. The room was vast. The frescoes on the vaulted ceiling had been worn away by time until they were barely discernible. Yet one could still glimpse its former splendor, faded gold leaf, ornately carved beams, and a massive bronze mirror hanging above the fireplace, its surface polished to a mirror, like shine, reflecting her pale, dazed face. The bed was covered with a gray sable fur mattress, typical of the north. The bedposts were carved from solid ebony, and a crystal lamp sat on the nightstand, its lamp oil already topped off, ready to be lit. A fire burned in the hearth, and the scent of burning pine filled the room, exactly the same as the one she had smelled on her cloak. Someone was crouched before the hearth, stoking the fire. It wasn't the housekeeper, but a young maid, no more than 15 or 16 years old, with very light, almost flaxen hair tied into two thick braids that fell over her shoulders. She turned her head at the sound of the door opening, and her whole face lit up. "You must be Miss Evelyn." She jumped to her feet, forgetting to brush the wood shavings from her hands, and ran over to perform an awkward curtsy, her eyes sparkling as she looked at her, like a little hunting dog seeing its new mistress. Evelyn instinctively took a step back. She wasn't used to being looked at like that. Not with scrutiny, not with disdain, not with pity, but with a fervor bordering on adoration. "My name is Leah. The butler sent me to attend to you," the girl chattered, her voice as crisp as the crackling of winter ice. "Are you hungry? There's still some venison pie and mushroom soup warming in the kitchen. Shall I bring them to you, or would you prefer tea first?" "The Duke said you were startled tonight, and ordered a soothing herbal tea to be brewed for you." "Wait," Evelyn interrupted, her voice slightly hoarse. "The Duke said that?" "Yes," Leah nodded, her expression one of absolute certainty. "He gave the order several times. He said you have an injury on your foot, so he asked me to have ointment ready, and to stay by the fireplace to keep the fire from going out. He said you're from the south and can't stand the cold of the northern nights." Evelyn slowly sat down on the edge of the bed, clasping her hands on her knees, her knuckles white with the pressure. She didn't know what to say. Every move this man made contradicted the rumors she'd heard. The Duke of Leonor in the rumors was iron-fisted, cold-blooded, and a killer who never blinked. In the rumors, he never smiled, never spoke a word more than necessary, and never did anything without expecting something in return. In the rumors, his attitude toward women was like that toward furniture. Their existence was justified, but they weren't worth a second glance. Yet he had taken her away from the bride, selection gathering, draped her mother's keepsake over her shoulders, prepared shoes that fit her perfectly, ordered a maid to apply medicine to her injured foot, and even forbade the fire in the hearth from being extinguished. What was that? Kindness? No, not kindness. She had seen the look in others' eyes when they gave alms to the poor, condescending, smug, self-righteous. There was none of that in his eyes. His gaze was like he was doing something he simply had to do, as if he had known all along that she would be standing there, her dress torn to shreds, mocked by everyone. The thought crawled up her spine, like a cold little snake, coiling around her heart and tightening inch by inch. "Miss," Leah's voice snapped her back to reality. "You look terrible. Would you like me to?" "I'm fine." Evelyn stood up and walked over to sit in front of the brass mirror. In the mirror, she was wearing an ivory, white linen nightgown, the ties at the neck left too loose, revealing a sliver of her collarbone. Her hair was down, dark brown, with a natural curl, and clung damply to both sides of her face. She rarely wore her hair down. Her stepmother said it made her look like a madwoman, like her dead mother, and brought bad luck to anyone who saw her. The person in the mirror felt like a stranger to her. It wasn't because she was beautiful. Her features weren't particularly delicate. Her eyebrows weren't fine enough. Her lips weren't thin enough. And there were a few faint freckles on her cheeks from the sun. But her eyes were bright. Not the kind of brightness that comes from being pampered, but the kind forged after falling too many times, like iron tempered by fire. She stared at those eyes in the mirror, and suddenly recalled the way the Duke had looked at her. What was he looking at? At this face that wasn't exactly stunning. At this frame so frail it could be blown away by a gust of wind. At the torn skirt at her feet and the pearls scattered across the floor. Number. He was looking at her eyes. He had stared into her eyes for a long time. Then he wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth. She sprang to her feet, startling Leah. "Miss, where is his study?" Leah blinked, hesitated, then whispered, "It's the innermost room on the second floor of the east wing." There's an ebony plaque on the door. But miss, the Duke isn't seeing anyone tonight. Evelyn had already pushed open the door and walked out. She knew this was madness. She knew she didn't know this man, didn't know this estate, didn't know why she was here. But she had to know the answer. If she was to stand in his study before sunrise tomorrow, face him, and hear him tell her in that icy tone what was to come, then there was at least one thing she had to know before he told her. Had he chosen her because of who she was, or because of whose daughter she was? The hallway was darker than when she'd come this way. Half the sconces were extinguished. Only a few at the far end still burned, their flames flickering feebly within their glass shades, stretching her shadow along the wall into a thin, elongated line. Her soft shoes made no sound on the carpet. Only her heartbeat pounded against her eardrums. Over and over, up to the second floor. Turn left. East wing. The corridor grew narrower, and the portraits on the walls changed. No longer were they portraits of successive dukes, but older murals, most of them eroded by time, leaving only faint outlines. She saw a massive white wolf, raising its head to howl at the moon, an army marching through black snow, and a woman standing on a cliff, draped in a black cloak, its silver clasp shining like a falling star. She stopped in her tracks. That mural sent a chill down her spine, not because it was terrifying, but because of the woman in the painting. She looked all too familiar. Not the face. The face had been smoothed away by time. It was the posture, the curve of the cloak draped over her shoulders, the way she held her chin high. Evelyn stared at the blurred silhouette of the woman, her heart beating faster and faster. You shouldn't be here. The voice came from behind her, low and hoarse, as if squeezed from deep within the stone walls. Evelyn spun around. The Duke stood in the shadows at the end of the corridor, coatless, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to his elbows, revealing his well-defined forearms. He held a glass of deep red wine, the light from the wall sconce reflected off the crystal, making it seem as though it were burning in the palm of his hand. His eyes shone eerily in the darkness, gray-blue, like two frozen sparks of phosphorus. "Did I ask you a question?" he repeated, his voice still calm, but Evelyn detected something entirely different. Not anger, but scrutiny, like a hunter watching to see if his prey would run. She opened her mouth, only to find her voice dry. "I'm here to ask you something." He moved slowly toward her. Each step was deliberate. His leather shoes made almost no sound on the carpet. Yet with every step he took, Evelyn felt the air grow thinner, until he stopped less than an arm's length away. Looking down at her from above, he towered over her. She came only to his chest, and had to tilt her head back to see the old scar on his chin glinting faintly silver in the candlelight. "Ask." Evelyn clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. The pain gave her back a little courage. She lifted her head, forcing her eyes to meet his. "Did you choose me? Because my father died by your hand?" The wind in the corridor suddenly stopped. The candle flame froze inside the glass shade, motionless, as if someone had clamped their hand around its throat. The Duke did not answer. He merely looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of an emotion she could not decipher appeared in his gray, blue eyes. Not anger, not guilt, not the panic of being exposed, but something deeper, darker, and heavier, as if some long dormant secret, startled by her single sentence, had stirred. He raised his hand, drained the red wine in his glass in one gulp, then set the empty glass down on the stone table beside him with a sharp clink. "Why would you think that?" His voice remained as calm as ever. But Evelyn noticed that the fingers that had held the glass tightened, ever so slightly. "Because Sir Merritt didn't die of illness." Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. "He was executed 3 years ago for treason. The execution order was signed with your name. She had said it. The words she had buried for 3 whole years, words that had weighed on her heart ever since the day she secretly opened that tin box in her father's old study, had finally been spoken. Inside that box lay her father's final letter, a single line scrawled in handwriting so messy it was barely legible. If I die, Charlene. There was also a palm-sized clipping from an old newspaper, reporting that Sir Merritt had been secretly executed for treason, signed by the Duke of the North. For 3 years, she had tried countless times to erase this memory from her mind. She told herself her father wasn't that kind of man. She told herself the Duke might have been merely following orders. She told herself the truth was probably more complicated than she imagined. But she couldn't help but hate him. She couldn't help but hate the man who had signed the execution order. And today, it was this man who pulled her out of the mud, draped a cloak over her shoulders, wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth, and led her into his manor. Pity? Redemption? Or did he have some other motive? The Duke was silent for a long time, so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, he reached out his hand. She instinctively closed her eyes, thinking he was going to strike her. Her stepmother always did that when she asked questions she shouldn't. But his hand did not land on her face. His fingers ran through her hair, his fingertips pressing against her scalp, warm and rough, sliding from the corner of her forehead, all the way behind her ear, tucking a stray strand of damp hair behind it. The touch was so light that Evelyn thought she was hallucinating. It was indeed I who signed your father's execution order. His voice was hushed, low enough that only the 2 of them could hear it. But if I hadn't signed it, those men would have made his death far more gruesome. Evelyn opened her eyes. His face was very close to hers, so close she could see the curve of his eyelashes, smell the tartness of red wine in his breath, and see her own reflection in his gray. Blue eyes, pale, frightened, and red-rimmed. What did you say? He didn't repeat himself. He simply withdrew his hand, took a step back, and restored the distance between them. Tomorrow at sunrise. The study, don't be late. He turned and walked away, the silhouette of his white shirt vanishing into the darkness at the end of the corridor, blending with the faded shadows on the murals. Evelyn stood rooted to the spot, her legs feeling as heavy as lead. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart pounding heavily and erratically inside, like a bird locked in a cage, banging its head until it bled. She didn't know what his last words meant, but she sensed vaguely that this estate held far more secrets than she had ever imagined. Her father's death, her stepmother's schemes, the humiliation of the bride, selection ceremony, all these fragments were slowly gathering above her head, forming a vast dark pattern. Deep in the corridor, the cloaked woman in the mural watched her silently by candlelight, the faint trace of color at the corner of her mouth, like a smile sealed by time. North of the north, blood of the blood. The wind swept through the tower, its wailing like a whisper that had never ceased. She barely slept a wink all night. Nights in the north are far longer than in the south. The wind seeped through the cracks in the tower's stone walls, howling low and deep, like some enormous beast panting outside the walls. The fire in the hearth burned all night long. Leah stood in the corner and stoked it 3 times, but Evelyn still felt cold. Not just physically, but a chill seeping from her very bones that she couldn't shake off no matter what. Wrapped in a sable blanket, she curled up in bed, her mind replaying the Duke's final words over and over. If I don't sign, those people will make his death even more agonizing. Who were those people? Why did they want her father dead? What had her father done? She recalled how her father had looked the last time he left home. It was a rainy night 3 years ago. He had burst out of his study, his face as pale as wax paper, a stack of parchment clutched in his hand, his knuckles turning blue. He crouched down and gripped her shoulders with such force that her bones ached. In his eyes was something she had never seen before. Not fear, but despair. The despair of a man who knew he was doomed. "Evelyn, listen." His voice was hoarse, as if sanded by sandpaper. "No matter what happens in the future, no matter what anyone tells you, Daddy never betrayed anyone, remember that. Always remember." Then he kissed her forehead, rushed out the front door, and never returned. 3 days later, her stepmother, Mrs. Vera, strolled into the living room wearing a brand new black silk dress and said in a voice so sweet it was sickening, "Your father is dead, treason. From now on, I'm in charge of this household." Evelyn remembered that she hadn't cried that day. She had simply stood there staring at her stepmother's face. Her stepmother was smiling. The curve of her lips was faint, but her eyes were laughing, not with the hysteria that follows overwhelming grief, but with the triumph of a victor standing on the bones of her defeated opponent. She hadn't understood it then. Why would a woman whose husband had just died feel triumphant? Now she sat on the bed in the Duke of the North's manor, a streak of pale gray light beginning to appear on the horizon outside the window, and she suddenly realized something. She had never truly known her father. She knew he liked strong tea for breakfast. She knew that when he told her bedtime stories, he'd turn every princess into a female knight. She knew there was a tin box hidden in his study, but she didn't know his political stance, didn't know who his enemies were in the court, didn't know why he had stormed out of the house on a rainy night, leaving behind the parting words, "Remember this." She had to know. So before the sun had fully risen, and before the housekeeper came to knock on her door, Evelyn had already dressed and pushed open the door. The hallway was dim. The candles in the sconces were nearly burned out. Their flames shrunk to the size of soybeans, clinging to life inside their glass shades. She walked barefoot across the carpet, not because she'd forgotten her shoes, but because she didn't want her footsteps to disturb anyone. Holding her slippers in her hand, her bare feet pressed against the carpet's pile. Each step felt like a cat treading on cotton. Second floor, east wing, the innermost room, an ebony nameplate. She remembered what Leah had said. The door at the end of the hallway was taller than she'd imagined. The grain of the ebony wood looked like a series of twisted faces in the shadows. The brass doorknob had been polished to a shine by the years, and embedded in the lintel was a slab of obsidian, upon which a single word was carved in silver paint, Veritas Latin, truth. She didn't knock, because she wasn't sure the Duke would let her in. But she had to go in. She wanted to see what was in his study before he came to speak with her. Intelligence letters, any trace left by her father. As her hand gripped the brass doorknob, her heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. The knob was cold, bone-chillingly cold. The metal's chill seeped through her palm, creeping up her arm and all the way to the back of her head. She took a deep breath and turned the knob. The door wasn't locked. The moment she pushed it open, a scent of old paper and cold iron hit her, mingled with the ash of burnt pine and a hint of leather's bitterness. The curtains were drawn, and only the embers in the fireplace cast a dim red glow, bathing the study in a dusky, blood-red hue. She stepped inside and gently closed the door behind her. The study was much larger than she had imagined. 2 walls were lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves crammed with parchment scrolls and gold-embossed volumes. Each row of spines bore a numbered label, arranged with a precision that made her scalp prickle. A massive ebony desk stood in the center of the room, its surface spotless, an inkwell, a quill pen, a letter opener, a stack of parchment. Every item was in its proper place, angled with millimeter precision. This man even controls the angle at which the inkwell is placed. She silently noted this to herself. A massive family tree hung on the wall above the fireplace. Black ink lines stretched upward from the bottom, branching and branching again, like an upside-down withered tree. Each name was marked with birth and death dates, and some were accompanied by small notes indicating the cause of death: killed in battle, executed, missing, or insane. She saw the Duke's name at the very bottom, with an empty space beside it. No spouse, no offspring. Then, in the lower right corner of the family tree, she saw another name: Merritt, her father's surname. Her heart skipped a beat. The writing was small, not in proper ink, but added later in pencil. The handwriting was scrawled yet forceful. A dotted line ran from her father's name to the Duke's mother's, the late Duchess Allegra Merritt Leonor, who had died 24 years ago. Evelyn's legs went weak. Was her father related by blood to the Duke's mother? Merritt, that surname on the Duke's family tree. What did this mean? Did it mean she shared the same blood as the Duke? No, not the same. Just distant relatives, but distant enough to be negligible. Or close enough too. You're early. The voice cut through the darkness like a knife. Evelyn spun around, her back slamming into the bookshelf. A book tumbled from the shelf, thudding onto the carpet with a dull thud. The Duke emerged from the shadows at the farthest corner of the study. He had clearly not left this room all night, still wearing that white shirt, the top 2 buttons undone, sleeves rolled above his elbows, revealing a sliver of his sharply defined forearm. His hair was no longer as immaculately coiffed as it had been yesterday. A few strands of black hair had fallen across his forehead, resting on his brow, making him look even more dangerous than he had last night. It was the kind of danger that comes from having completely shed one's social mask. In his hand, he held a letter opener. The silver blade spun slowly between his fingers, reflecting the red glow of the embers in the fireplace. "Sneaking into someone's study," he said, stopping 3 paces away from her, tilting his head slightly, his gray-blue eyes shining with startling intensity in the shadows. "Is that considered polite where you come from?" Evelyn dug her fingertips into the palm of her hand. The pain forced her to suppress her fear. She lifted her chin, her voice trembling, but each word spoken with precision. "Hiding one's true origins from others, is that considered polite in your circles?" The Duke's fingers froze. The letter opener paused at his fingertips, its cold silver gleam suspended mid-air. The two stared at each other from 3 paces apart. A piece of well-burned wood in the fireplace collapsed, sending a shower of sparks flying and crackling loudly. Then, the Duke did something Evelyn had not anticipated at all. He smiled. It wasn't a real smile, only a minuscule curve at the corners of his mouth, fleeting, almost imperceptible. But the ice in those eyes did indeed crack open a fissure, revealing something far more complex through the gap. Was it admiration, or some kind of heavy sorrow she couldn't decipher? "Not bad," he said, casually slipping the letter opener back into its brass holder on the desk with a crisp, decisive motion. "You're more like him than I imagined." "Like whom?" "Your father." He walked around the desk and drew back the curtains. The first rays of morning light poured in through the tall window, grayish, white and biting, carving his profile into 2 distinct halves of light and shadow. "Your father burst into my study just like this back then. Only that time, he was carrying a sword." Her father had been here, carrying a sword. "Sit down." The Duke gestured to the chair opposite the desk and took his seat behind it. The morning light fell from behind him, casting his face almost entirely in shadow, leaving only his eyes glowing like luminous ore at the bottom of a deep pool. She didn't move. "I have no patience to repeat myself." She walked over and sat down. The chair was hard, with a straight back, as if designed specifically to make the sitter uncomfortable. She placed her hands on her knees, her fingers twisting the hem of her skirt, crumpling the fabric and smoothing it out, crumpling it and smoothing it out. The Duke pulled a document from a drawer and pushed it toward her. Yellowed parchment, its edges frayed, bore the wax seal of the kingdom's privy council. The griffin and crossed swords had faded but remained imposing. The title was written in large black letters, Top Secret Operation Unwavering. This is a copy of the intelligence your father took from me before he died. The Duke's voice was quiet, yet each word felt like a hammer driven into wood. He rushed out of the Duke's mansion with the original, sending it back to the capital overnight, intending to present it to the Privy Council. Then he was arrested, charged with treason. Evelyn stared at the document, her pupils contracting, her breathing ragged. She could feel the blood draining from her face and her fingertips growing cold. What intelligence? The Duke did not answer immediately. He stood up, walked to the fireplace, picked up a poker, and stirred the embers. Sparks flew, flickering at his feet. His silhouette, standing at the boundary between morning light and shadow, looked strangely lonely, like a caged beast trapped within stone walls. 24 years ago, my mother was murdered. His voice was so calm it didn't sound as if he were speaking of himself. In her own bedroom, the killer was never found. The official story was that remnants of the northern rebels had infiltrated the estate and poisoned her, but I never believed it. He turned, his gray, blue eyes fixed on Evelyn. Your father didn't believe it either. He spent his entire life investigating. What he uncovered was too sordid enough to topple this kingdom. What did he find? The Duke placed the poker back on the iron rack. The clang of metal echoed through the empty study for a long time. He discovered that the person who truly killed my mother was not your father's enemy, not the northern rebels, and not even a foreign foe. His voice dropped like a boulder rolling into an abyss, emitting a fatal clang only when it struck the bottom. It was the current king's mother. After my mother gave birth to the heir, she used a packet of slow-acting poison to swap the Duchess's position. For my mother's maid, Vera, the parchment slipped from Evelyn's fingers, fluttered twice, and landed face down on the carpet. She stared at the words maid, Vera, her stepmother, Vera. A wave of intense nausea churned in her stomach, like a punch to the gut, and a sour liquid rose in her throat. She gripped the chair's armrest tightly, her fingernails scraping against the varnish on the wood, producing a grating sound. Vera, my stepmother, Vera. Her voice was so hoarse, it didn't sound like her own. Every word was torn from her throat. The Duke didn't answer. He leaned against the edge of his desk, arms crossed over his chest, his gray-blue eyes never leaving her face. He was watching her reaction, not a cold scrutiny, but something harder to describe, as if he were gauging whether she was strong enough to withstand the next blow. After my mother died, he finally spoke, his voice as steady as if he were reciting a document. Vera vanished from the Duke's estate. No one investigated the whereabouts of a mere maid. But 3 years later, she appeared in the capital, having changed her name and married a recently widowed old lord. Another 5 years passed, and the old lord died. The cause of death was also slow poison. Later still, she married your father, bringing with her the estates of her 2 deceased husbands. Evelyn felt her blood run cold. She recalled the day her stepmother first walked through the door. Vera wore a dark red velvet gown, her hair pulled back into a haughty bun, 6 rings on 10 fingers. She crouched down and pinched Evelyn's cheeks, her nails digging painfully into the skin, and said with a smile, "What a pretty little girl. From now on, I'm your mother." Her voice was as sweet as syrup, but those eyes, those bright green eyes, surveyed her from head to toe like a butcher weighing a cut of meat. She had been only 8 years old then, and didn't know what that look meant. Now she knew. It was a woman who had poisoned 2 duchesses, calculating how to remove the 3rd obstacle. And her father, he married that woman, only to be executed 3 years later on charges of treason. So Evelyn bent down to pick up the document from the floor, her fingers trembling so much she could barely hold it. So my father wasn't a traitor. He just found out something he wasn't supposed to. He discovered that the king's mother had murdered my mother. The Duke's voice grew cold, colder than the freezing point, and he tried to present the evidence to the Privy Council. So they struck first, fabricating evidence of treason and forcing me to sign the execution order. He paused, and something spread through his gray-blue eyes, like an undercurrent beneath the ice finally bursting through the frozen surface. They put my name on your father's death warrant precisely because they knew, once he was dead, once the truth came to light, you would hate me so much that you could never stand by my side. The study was silent for a long time. Morning light crept slowly across the high windows, dust swirling in the rays like countless tiny, silent explosions. The last ember in the fireplace collapsed, a spark flickering briefly before everything fell into complete stillness. Evelyn stood up. Her legs were trembling. Her knee struck the edge of the desk, causing her to gasp in pain. But she did not sit back down. Before my mother died, she had such a high fever that even I didn't recognize her. She kept calling out a name. Her voice trembled, her eyes reddened, but there were no tears. She was calling for Allegra. She called for her all night long. The Duke's eyelashes twitched slightly. It was the first time she had seen a crack in his defenses, a very, very fine fissure, fleeting but undeniable. She continued, I always thought Allegra was a friend of hers, or a relative from her hometown. But Allegra, that's your mother's name, isn't it? Did my mother know your mother? The Duke straightened up. He walked over to the bookshelf, pulled a thin leather, bound volume from the third shelf, flipped to the middle, and took out a yellowed sheet of paper to hand to her. It was a charcoal sketch. The lines were blurred and faded, but she could still make out the subject. 2 young women sitting side by side beneath an old oak tree, one with black hair, the other with brown, their heads resting against each other, laughing with complete abandon. The dark-haired woman wore a cloak fastened with a silver brooch, the design of which was identical to the one Evelyn had worn the night before. The brown-haired woman had soft features, and there was a familiarity between her brows and eyes, the kind Evelyn saw every day in the mirror, the kind that made her heart tighten. They weren't just acquaintances. The Duke's voice fell upon her from above, low and steady, yet he placed extra weight on the final word. They were sisters. That is why, after my mother died, your mother married your father, an ordinary baron who belonged to no major noble house, lived far from the capital, and led a quiet life in a small southern town. She thought that by doing so she could save her own life and yours. He paused for a second, but she died anyway. A high fever that wouldn't break. She died in bed. Exactly the same symptoms my mother had back then. Evelyn clutched the sketch, her knuckles turning white. She looked at the carefree smiles of the 2 young women in the drawing and suddenly felt as if something blunt had struck her chest with great force. The pain wasn't sharp. It was dull, heavy, and overwhelming. 16 years of resentment and fear finally finding their true outlet. She had believed her suffering stemmed from her stepmother's favoritism, her sister's malice, and the unfairness of fate. But the truth was, from the night a woman used a slow-acting poison to kill the Duchess of Allegra, from that rainy night her father uncovered the first piece of intelligence. Everything she had endured was a premeditated murder, not an accident, not fate, a trap. She lifted her head, her eyes red, rimmed, yet her voice steadied. That steadiness wasn't calm. It was the certainty that came from finally knowing what she was fighting for. You chose me, at the bride selection ball in front of everyone. It wasn't a coincidence. You planned it. The Duke looked at her, her small silhouette reflected in his gray-blue eyes. Vera and Loretta thought that by pushing you into the bride selection, they'd completely ruin your reputation in front of everyone, cutting off any possibility of you marrying into nobility. Because as long as you have no backing, they can crush you like a bug whenever they please. Just like they crushed your mother, just like they crushed my mother. He took a step forward. The distance between them narrowed to just a hand's breadth. She could even feel the heat radiating from his body. But what they didn't know was that I was waiting for the very moment you stood there. I wanted them to push you right into my arms with their own hands. Evelyn's pupils contracted sharply. So you said the bride selection would end. You said you'd already chosen. Wasn't that an impulse? I've never acted on impulse in my life. His voice was low, so low it seemed to be squeezed from the very depths of his chest. His forehead was almost touching hers. His breath brushed against her own, warm, dry, and tinged with the lingering bitterness of red wine. From the day I knew you were her daughter, this choice was already made. You are the last bloodline of the Merritt family, the last living relative my mother has in this world. He paused for a moment, looking deep into her eyes. And the only pawn. Evelyn felt her heart drop an inch. A pawn. He'd called her a pawn. Not a lover, not a gift, not a twist of fate. A pawn. But strangely, she didn't feel offended, nor did she feel the anger of being used, because he hadn't lied to her. From start to finish, he hadn't uttered a single sweet word, hadn't made a single empty promise. He had laid all the truth before her, including the ugliest parts, and then let her choose for herself. This was the Duke of Leonor. Even his partnerships felt like battles. Evelyn took a deep breath, silently reciting her father's last words in her mind, then pushed the top-secret document back toward the Duke. What do you need me to do? A faint, almost imperceptible curve appeared at the corner of the Duke's mouth. He turned and pulled another document from the drawer, a pristine sheet of parchment with terms already written upon it, the ink half dry, glowing with a faint blue hue in the morning light. A contract. The Duke's seal had already been affixed, the silver-gray wax imprint, forming the silhouette of a soaring eagle on the paper. A blank space remained beside it, waiting for another person's signature. "Marry me," he said, his tone no different from when he'd say, "Close the window." In name only, no one in aristocratic circles would question a betrothal arranged at a bride selection gathering. It gives you status, grants you immunity, and ensures that no one can lay a finger on you when you stand behind me. Evelyn stared at the terms of the contract, reading them one by one, her heart pounding like a drum. Rights and obligations. Declaration of inheritance. Declaration of immunity. Declaration of immunity. Declaration of family alliance. Each clause was written with clinical detachment, like a military treaty, until the very last line additional clause. This contract shall automatically terminate upon the completion of the revenge. It may be terminated early by mutual consent. It meant that once they were all dead on Vera, once the woman hiding behind the throne who had poisoned her, and once everyone involved in this murder had paid the price, this marriage contract would automatically become as worthless as scrap paper. They would go their separate ways, owing each other nothing. She closed her eyes and took 3 deep breaths. 16 years. Under her stepmother's rule, she had lived like a bug that could be crushed at any moment, her skirt torn, mocked, stripped of all dignity. And now this man was handing her the blade of vengeance and asking her, would she use it? She opened her eyes and picked up the quill. Her hand was steady as the nib touched the page. The ink spread across the parchment, forming her name, Evelyn Merritt. As she finished the last letter, she added a long, sweeping stroke after her surname, leaving a faint indentation on the paper. The Duke took the pen and wrote his name beside hers. The 2 signatures, stroke by stroke, lay side by side on the page, like 2 swords finally drawn together. He tucked the contract into a drawer, stood up and walked to the window. Morning light had fully risen. A northern sunrise was not as gentle as one in the south. The light was sharp and cold, falling upon the endless black pine forest beyond the manor, as if dusted with a layer of iron-gray frost. From today on, you don't need to go back to that home. Vera won't come looking for you herself. She wouldn't dare set foot in the north. But Loretta and Cecily will come. They'll attend the engagement ceremony, bringing smiles, gifts, and their probing venomous words. All you have to do is make them think you're still the same as before, a pitiful creature they can mold and manipulate at will. He turned away, the light behind him outlining the silhouette of his shoulders, and back tall, silent, like a cliff that would never crumble. Can I pull it off? Evelyn stood up, tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, and lifted her head to meet his gaze. Her eyes shone with startling intensity in the morning light. Not the timidity of 16 years of abuse, but the fire of 16 years of being kindled. I've played the pathetic one my whole life. Your Grace, playing it for a few more days won't be difficult. Outside the window, the wind swept through the pine forest, emitting a low howling sound, as if a million strings were being plucked by a single invisible hand. In the distance, the snow-capped mountains of the north revealed their silvery peaks in the morning light, gazing unchanging upon this blood-soaked land. And in the study, the embers in the fireplace had finally grown cold. But no one felt the chill. Winter comes earlier to the north than anywhere else. When the first snow of October fell, an envoy from the capital arrived, bearing a personal letter from the king. The letter was couched in the most courteous terms, inviting Duke Leonor and his fiancée, Miss Evelyn Merritt, to the capital to attend the winter hunt ceremony, as a sign of the royal family's blessing for their engagement. The edges of the paper were gilded with gold foil, and the royal griffin crest was stamped upon the wax seal. Every detail exuded dignity and honor. Evelyn stood at the study window, reading the letter 3 times before looking up at the man seated behind the desk. It's a trap. The Duke did not look up. He was polishing the letter opener. The silver blade glinted inch by inch in the candlelight, its spine reflecting his impassive eyes. Of course. And you're still going? He placed the letter opener back in its brass stand, stood up, walked over to her, snatched the letter from her hand, and casually tossed it into the fireplace. The flames greedily licked at the parchment. The gold leaf curled and blackened in the intense heat, the griffin crest warping into a grotesque shape before turning to ash. It's not that I'm going. He turned, his gray-blue eyes resting on her face, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It's us. The carriage convoy arrived at the capital 7 days later. It had been 3 months since Evelyn had set foot in this city. 3 months ago, she had been a fallen heiress, whose dress had been torn to shreds by her stepsister, huddled in the corner of the carriage, trembling, without even a pair of shoes on her feet. 3 months later, she sat in the Duke's carriage, wearing a long black velvet gown from the north, a silver rose brooch pinned to her neckline, and the Duke's family ring on her finger, an obsidian setting engraved with the words "North of the North, Blood of Blood." Her stepmother, Lady Vera, greeted them at the gates of Rose Manor. She wore a long, grape, purple satin gown. Her hair dyed a deeper gold. When she smiled, the curve of her lips was precise to the millimeter, just like a meticulously calibrated doll. Loretta and Cecily stood on either side of her, their smiles more painful to behold than tears. Cecily's chin was dotted with several pimples that the powder couldn't conceal, gleaming with oil in the sunlight. Loretta's knuckles were white as she clenched her fan, her bones nearly piercing the skin. "Welcome back, dear Evelyn." Vera opened her arms, her voice as sweet as arsenic dipped in honey. "We've missed you so much." Evelyn stepped down from the carriage. She didn't shy away from Vera's embrace. In fact, she reached out her arms to hug her back. She pressed her lips close to Vera's earlobe, her voice so soft that only the two of them could hear it. "I've missed you too, Mother. So much that I couldn't sleep at night." Vera's body stiffened for an instant, a barely perceptible moment. Then she smiled even more brightly, squeezed Evelyn's hand, and turned to lead them into the manor. The winter hunt ceremony's banquet was held in the great hall. It was the very same hall where, 3 months earlier, Evelyn's dress had been torn to shreds. 700 candles still burned in the chandeliers. The scent of gold dust and bay leaves still lingered in the air. And even the music played by the orchestra was exactly the same as that day. Everything was repeating itself, like a deliberately orchestrated rondo, as if to awaken some humiliated ghost. As Evelyn entered the hall, 300 pairs of eyes fell upon her at once. Just as 3 months ago, they were filled with scrutiny, appraisal, curiosity, and unconcealed jealousy. The difference was that these gazes now contained something else. Fear, for they had recognized the silver brooch at her neckline. The silver brooch from the Duke of the North's cloak, worn not draped over her shoulders, but pinned over her heart. It was a declaration. Not a declaration that she belonged to him. A declaration that they stood on the same side. As the dinner reached the third course, Cecily rose to propose a toast. Holding a glass of champagne with fine bubbles rising to the surface, she walked toward Evelyn in her high heels, her face adorned with the exact same smile as 3 months ago. Sweet to the point of cloying, sharp enough to cut. "Evelyn, my dear sister," her voice echoed through the hall, deliberately raised so everyone could hear. "Congratulations on finally finding your place in life. After all, given your circumstances, I mean, your background, to have landed the Duke is truly a stroke of luck. We all know that back in the day, your mother was nothing more than a poor relative who'd bitten off more than she could chew, didn't she?" Scattered snickers rippled through the hall. Evelyn stood up, holding her glass. She felt the Duke's gaze fixed on her from the head table. He hadn't risen, hadn't spoken, just watched her. He was watching to see how she would respond. She looked down at Cecily, the woman who had once stepped on her skirt, leaving her standing naked before everyone, and who now held a glass of champagne, waiting for her to break down, waiting for her to run out with red-rimmed eyes, waiting for her to lose her composure in front of the Duke and be cast aside. Evelyn smiled. She raised her glass and clinked it against Cecily's, producing a crisp tinkle. Then, in a voice not loud but clear enough, she said, "Thank you for your blessing, sister, but you're a little off." She paused, her gaze sweeping across every face in the room before settling on her stepmother. "Vera, my mother was not a poor relative who married above her station. My mother's maiden name was Merit, the same lineage as the late Duchess Allegra." In other words, she tilted her head, her smile as gentle as if discussing the weather. "The blood flowing through my veins comes from the same source as the Duke's family. And your mother, Lady Vera." Her voice didn't rise a single notch, but every whisper in the hall was silenced in that instant. "What line of work was your mother in before she married my father? A maid or laundress?" The champagne glass slipped from Cecily's fingers, crashing onto the marble floor and shattering into a scattering of crystalline shards and spattering foam. Her stepmother, Vera, lifted her face from her seat. She was still smiling, but the muscles beneath that smile were twitching, and the fine lines at the corners of her eyes held a serpentine alertness, as if she'd been struck at her weakest point. She stood up and wiped the corner of her mouth with a napkin, her movements impeccably graceful. "Evelyn," her voice was as soft as silk, "are you too tired? Let Loretta accompany you to rest for a while." Loretta rose from her seat, but before she could take a single step, another voice cut through the room from the head table. "She doesn't need to go anywhere." The Duke leaned back in his chair, twirling his wineglass, his gray-blue eyes casually sweeping over Vera's face. He didn't say much, just 7 words, but the air in the entire hall grew heavy, like the deathly silence before a sudden drop in air pressure. A crack finally appeared in Vera's smile. Then, the hall doors swung open, It wasn't a servant who pushed them open. It was an officer of the Royal Privy Council, clad in a steel gray uniform. 6 officers filed in, their boot heels striking the marble floor, each step producing a uniform, rhythmic clack, like the tolling of a death knell before an execution. The officer at the head held a scroll of parchment, its reverse bearing the wax seal of the kingdom's High Court of Justice. Not a griffin, but a balance and a sword. The king himself followed behind. He was in his early 40s, well preserved, his smile the spitting image of Vera's, refined, dignified, and flawless. His mother, the elderly Queen Dowager Margaret, walked slowly behind him, leaning on his arm. Her silver hair was pulled back into a high bun, and the hem of her black mourning gown trailed on the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen, there is no need to rise," the king said, raising his hand with a tone as warm as if he were presiding over a family gathering. "I am merely here to announce the outcome of a minor retrial of an old case. It will only take a few minutes of your time." His gaze swept across the hall, lingering on Vera's face for less than half a second before moving on. The chief executive unfurled the parchment and began to read. He read from the forged treason verdict issued 3 years prior. The original text was listed point by point, then refuted one by one. Fabricated evidence, bribed witnesses, tampered dates, forged seals. Every word was laid bare, like layer upon layer of rotten flesh being peeled away to reveal the stark white truth beneath. Finally, the chief executive cleared his throat and read the final sentence. "All charges against Sir Merritt are hereby dismissed, his title and honor restored, and the state shall provide full compensation to his surviving family members. As for those involved in forging the documents back then," he looked up, his gaze settling on his stepmother, Vera, "Mrs. Vera Merritt, Miss Loretta Merritt, and Miss Cecily Merritt are to be arrested immediately on charges of treason, forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder." The hall erupted. Not literally. Not a single person dared to move. 300 noblemen and women froze in their seats, their expressions shifting from shock to fear to frantic calculations of how to distance themselves from the scandal. Each person flashed through countless expressions in a single second. Cecily let out a scream and collapsed to the floor, her high heels knocking over a chair. Loretta turned to run but was pinned down by 2 officers, her face pressed against the floor tiles. As she struggled, her skirt ripped from her thigh all the way to her ankle, exposing the petticoat beneath, in exactly the same spot and with the exact same sound as Evelyn's that day. But no one dared to laugh. Her stepmother, Vera, did not run. She stood there, wineglass still in hand, her fingers steady as iron. She looked at Evelyn, her green eyes holding no fear, only a cold, unmasked scrutiny. Then she smiled, not the sweet, fake smile from before, but a more genuine one, tinged with contempt. "You think you've won?" Her voice was soft, audible only to Evelyn. "You think that man chose you because he loves you. Don't be naive, little girl. He's a monster even colder than I am. He didn't choose you. He chose your blood. Once you've borne him an heir, your fate won't be much better than mine." Evelyn took a step forward, raised her hand, and slapped her. The sound was crisp, like a bone snapping. Vera's head jerked to the side from the blow, a trickle of blood seeping from the corner of her mouth. She slowly turned back, her eyes finally revealing shock. Not because of the slap. It was because the person who struck her hadn't flinched. Evelyn's entire palm was red and swollen, but her eyes were dry, cold, and as hard as tempered steel. "Thank you for reminding me," Evelyn said, her voice so steady that the astonishment in Vera's eyes turned to fear. "But you've got one thing wrong. I don't need him to love me, nor do I need him to choose me. I chose myself. The night you pushed me into the bride selection gathering, you personally thrust me into his path. You thought you were destroying me, but in fact, you were paving my way. So this slap is on behalf of my mother. The rest will be settled in court." She took a step back and turned toward the main table. 300 pairs of eyes followed her retreating figure. The hall fell so silent that all that remained was Cecily's sobbing, and the grating sound of Loretta's shoes scraping against the floor as she was dragged away. The Duke stood up. He did not embrace her, nor did he make any public vows. He simply picked up the black cloak draped over the back of her chair, the one he'd brought with him neatly folded 3 months ago, and draped it back over her shoulders, fastening the silver clasp. The motion was exactly the same as that day. His slender fingers gathered the wool before her collarbone, the warmth of his fingertips seeping through the fabric into her skin, neither too light nor too heavy, just right. Then he leaned down and whispered a sentence into her ear. His voice was so low that only she could hear it, so low that even the officer standing right beside them couldn't make out a single syllable. But Evelyn heard it clearly. Her eyelashes fluttered sharply, then dropped, like a butterfly closing its wings. She said nothing. She simply reached out and gently tugged at his cuff. It was a tug, not a grasp. Her fingers clenched the fabric of his black military tuxedo cuff, her knuckles tightening as if she had finally found a rope that wouldn't snap in the midst of a blizzard. The Duke did not look down, did not respond, and did not show the slightest sign of softening in front of the 300 people present. But he did not pull his sleeve away either. Duke Leonor, Lord of the Northern Frontier, the kingdom's iron-fisted bulwark, had never in any public setting allowed anyone to touch his sleeve. As her stepmother, Vera, was escorted out of the hall, she glanced back. The last scene she witnessed was the girl she had trampled underfoot for 16 years, standing directly beneath the grand chandelier, draped in the Northern Duke's cloak, her entire form glowing in the candlelight, her profile as sharp as if carved by a knife, a spitting image of the man standing behind her. Vera suddenly burst into laughter. It was a shrill, broken laugh that echoed through the corridor for a long time. She recalled the face of another woman from 24 years ago. Another woman killed by a slow-acting poison, delirious with fever in her final moments. That woman had had the same look in her eyes, not one of weakness, passivity, or helplessness. She was waiting for the right moment to repay every ounce of humiliation with interest. Allegra waited 24 years. Her daughter repaid it for her. Vera's laughter was locked deep within the dungeon, by the iron gate, never to be heard again. A month later, in the small chapel of the Duke of the North's estate, there were no 700 candles, no gold dust, and no laurel leaves. Only 12 rows of oak benches, pine wood burning in the hearth, and heavy snow falling silently outside the window. The housekeeper's hands trembled as she helped Evelyn fasten her veil. It wasn't from nervousness. It was because the man standing at the church door was dressed in a military uniform of all black, standing in the freezing draft at -20 degrees. Having waited for a full 40 minutes, no one dared to rush him, nor did anyone dare to rush her. As Evelyn walked toward him, she held a bouquet of wild roses from the north, their stems covered in thorns, never pruned. Leah had told her she was mad, asking why she hadn't had the gardener tend to them beforehand. Evelyn had said it wasn't necessary. She walked up to him holding that thorny bouquet. Her fingers were pricked in several places, and beads of blood seeped out, staining the white sepals red. The Duke glanced down at her bleeding fingers. Something stirred in his gray, blue eyes, then he suppressed it. "You've hurt yourself again," he said. "It's not again," she said. She shifted the bouquet to her left hand and held out her right palm to him, revealing the tiny puncture wounds from the thorns and the thin calluses worn into her skin, some from practicing swordsmanship over the past 3 months, others from even earlier, left behind from scrubbing floors and wringing out rags at her stepmother's house. "It's just that before, when I got hurt, no one cared now. When I get hurt, someone does." The Duke remained silent for a full 10 seconds. Then he removed his leather gloves and slipped them onto her hands, one by one. They were too big, the fingers were half empty, and they hung loosely at the wrists, the leather imbued with his body heat and the scent of pine. He gripped her wrists and rolled up her sleeves twice, his movements sharp and decisive, as if fitting a weapon. The priest cleared his throat, opened the book of rites, and began reciting the vows. Halfway through, a sudden gust of wind flung the church doors open, and snow swirled in from outside. Everyone flinched, but Evelyn remained still. She gazed toward the doorway, at the white blizzard outside, and suddenly spoke softly. "My father used to say that the snow in the north never stops falling. He came here once, and he could never forget it." She turned to look at the Duke. The curve of her lips was faint, but her eyes shone, the kind of light seen only in those who have finally emerged from a long night to catch the first rays of dawn. "Now, I know why." The Duke did not reply, but when the priest uttered the words, "Do you?" he spoke before the priest could finish the last syllable. "I do." The priest froze. According to the ceremony, he hadn't finished asking the question, but he glanced at the Duke's expression, swallowed hard, turned to Evelyn, and quickened his pace. "Do you?" She, too, answered before he could finish. Neither of them waited for the priest to finish. Neither of them hesitated. The priest cleared his throat, closed the book, and declared them husband and wife. The Duke removed his family ring, the one made of obsidian engraved with the language of the North, and slipped it onto Evelyn's ring finger. It was too big, he had to push it down twice before it reached the base of her finger. Then he held her fingers, tracing the thin calluses on her palm one by one, moving slowly, as if reading a book written on her skin. "North of the North." He looked at her. She continued, "Blood of blood." He turned her hand over, pressing his fingertips against the tiny wounds in her palm, pricks from rose thorns, and lingered there for a long time. Then he lowered his head, his lips brushing against her fingertip, half covered by a glove, and whispered the same words he had spoken at the winter hunt banquet. The words only she could hear, but this time, Evelyn answered him. She stood on tiptoe, leaned close to his ear, and murmured a few words. Her voice was so soft that the wind and snow drowned out most of it, but after she spoke, Duke Leonor, the man who never smiled and never said a word more than necessary, curved the corners of his mouth, not just a barely perceptible smile, a genuine one, like ice finally broken by spring water, revealing the living stream beneath. He reached out to tuck her wind, tousled hair behind her ear, his touch as gentle as the one he'd used that night, outside her study. The snow was still falling outside the window. Indeed, the snow in the north never seemed to stop. But as Evelyn nestled against his chest, gazing at the black pine forest blanketed in white, she suddenly felt that the winter here wasn't as cold as the rumor suggested. She closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of pine and cold iron. This time, she no longer needed to ask why.